The drift warning came in on the slow channel. It was 4 words long, Sol's cone. 9 days. Coordinator Ilm Sarat read it twice. She did not change expression. Then she wrote the reply that would be argued over for the next 7,000 years, and she wrote it the way anyone writes anything at the end of a long shift, without ceremony, without any sense that she was doing something that would outlive her. Understood. Do not warn them. I was 11 light hours from her desk when she sent that, folded into a hull that had been built to delete itself from the sky, and I did not learn what she had written until it no longer mattered. My name is Avith Nguyen. I was second listener aboard the survey vessel we called the Held Breath, which is not a poetic name. It is a technical one. It describes the operating condition of the ship. Here is what you need to understand about the way we lived. The Quiet Concorde had 2,411 signatory worlds. Not one of them broadcast. Not one of them had broadcast in 7,040 years, which is longer than most of our members had possessed the concept of a year, because the doctrine predated the languages that argued about it. The rule was one sentence, and children learned it before they learned to count. Signal is a hand raised in the dark. The training for it took 9 years. I remember the 3rd year best because that was the year they stopped teaching us and started correcting us. A hull technician named Vosh Dell taught my cohort thermal discipline. She did not lecture. She would walk the row of us while we worked, and she would put a finger against the back of your neck when your heat signature spiked, which it did when you were frustrated, and which it did when you were proud, and which it did when you were afraid, and after 4 months of that, you simply stopped being any of those things where instruments could see you. Dell had one scar across her jaw. She never explained it, and nobody asked. On the last day, she told us that she had been posted to a world called Enet Reach, and that Enet Reach had run an unshielded relay for 6 days in order to coordinate a harvest across 2 hemispheres, and that she had been off-world for the 5th day. She did not say what happened on the 6th. She did not have to. We had all seen the number. 11,600. That is not the population of Enet Reach. That is the count of what was recovered. We had a word for the things that took them. The sift. Nobody in the Concorde had a picture of one. We had drift maps, we had loss ledgers, we had 400 years of statistical work that told us where they moved and how fast, and we had absolutely nothing that told us what they looked like, because every observer who had ever gotten close enough to see one had also been close enough to be found. That was the shape of our knowledge. We knew them entirely by the holes they left. So we hid. All of us. Every species that survived long enough to sign the doctrine had arrived at the same answer independently. And when 1,000 strangers reached the same conclusion without speaking to each other, you stop calling it a theory. Then there was Earth. I had the file. Everyone in Deep Survey had the file, and everyone in Deep Survey read it more than once, which was itself a violation of procedure, because we were not supposed to spend attention on a system already flagged for loss. The humans had begun leaking in their year 1936. By the time I sat watching them, they had been broadcasting continuously for 127 years. Not signal discipline failures, not accidents, entertainment, weather reports, arguments about sport. 127 years of a species standing in the open with its hands up, shouting, and the drift maps showed 4 separate sift migrations that had passed within range of that noise, and the humans were still there. 4, that was the number I could not put down. 1 is luck, 2 is luck being generous. 4 is a pattern, and patterns are the only thing my people were ever any good at, and every model we ran on this one came back with the same answer, which was that the model was wrong. Survey Master Dothran did not read the file more than once. He was 200 years into a career built entirely on not being surprised, and he had a way of ending a conversation that involved no words at all, only a slight turn of the head toward whatever you were supposed to be doing instead. I asked him about it on the 9th day of the watch. 4 passes, I said. No losses. No confirmed losses. There's no wreckage. There's no debris cone. There's nothing. He looked at the display for a moment. Then he said, "There's a species that hasn't been eaten yet," and turned his head slightly toward my station. And that was the end of it. We had been in cold shadow above their outer system for 6 weeks. 0 emission. 0 drive activity. Our hull was doing the one thing it had been built across 4 centuries to do, which is to occupy a volume of space and give back nothing. No heat. No reflection. No shape, so that anything looking at us would record only the stars behind where we were, and never notice that a few of them were briefly missing. On the 43rd day, the human ship arrived and parked 11 kilometers off our flank. It made no attempt to hide. It ran lights, it ran drive, it came in loud enough that the passive array clipped, and it stopped exactly where a vessel would stop if it could see us, and then it transmitted on an open channel, and the transmission was addressed to us by the sound shape our own species uses for itself, which no other species in the Concord had ever been given. Duthrin gave an order then. In the founding annexes, it is recorded as the first sentence of the unmasking. At the time, it was only a tired man telling a junior officer to keep his hands off a panel, and he gave it in the flat voice he used for everything, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to explain to people that he was not being brave. He was afraid. I could hear it. It was the first time in 20 years I had heard anything in his voice at all. He gave the order, and nobody moved. That is what I remember. Not the ship, not the lights, not the open channel still repeating in the array like something knocking. 11 people in a compartment built for silence, and every one of them waiting for a second-year officer's hands to stop shaking before anything else could happen. Our hulls took 406 years to develop. The final generation returns less than 1 part in 9 million of incident radiation, holds surface differential under 1/10 of a degree, and vents nothing at all ever, which is why a Samurai deep survey vessel can only stay on station for 51 days before the crew begins to cook inside their own waste heat. 43 of ours were gone. We had 8 days of hiding left in us, and a human sitting 11 kilometers away with her running lights on. Duthrin said it was a lure. He said it the way he said everything, flat, from the middle of a sentence he had apparently started somewhere private. A sift construct, a shape built to look like prey, broadcasting a species name harvested off a dead relay, waiting for something frightened to answer it. He ordered the channel burned and the array physically disconnected. He was not wrong to think it. There was a school of loss analysis that had argued for that exact tactic for 200 years, and I had written a paper on it. And I want to be honest about this because most accounts of that day make me sound better than I was. I agreed with him. Then she came across without a suit.
Not without a suit.
Without armor, without escort, without a weapon on her anywhere. In a soft pressure garment the color of nothing, carrying a case in one hand and something folded under her arm, and she came through our lock alone, and stood there while 11 people who had been trained since childhood to be undetectable stared at a woman who had walked into the dark holding a light. Her heat signature did not move. I want to be precise about that because it is the detail I could not put down. Ours moved. Mine spiked hard enough that Vosh Dell would have had a finger on the back of my neck inside a second. The human stayed flat through the lock cycle, through the first sight of us, through Duthrin, crossing the compartment with 2 of the crew behind him, and it did not move because she was not managing it. She simply was not producing it. She was calm, the way a stone is calm. Duthrin stopped a meter from her and asked the question in front of the entire watch, which is a thing you do when you have already decided what the answer is going to be and you want witnesses to it. How are you here? I flew, she said. Somebody made a sound. She did not appear to notice. Our position is not detectable. Yeah, she set the case down. Can I ask what your hull does with starlight? He told her. He should not have. He told her because the question was so small and so wrong that answering it felt like correcting a child, and because a man who has been right for 200 years develops a reflex for demonstrating it, and because she had asked it in a tone that suggested she genuinely did not know and would be grateful to be told, absorption near total. 9 parts in a million returned. Right, she said. So you don't reflect, you subtract. She unfolded the thing under her arm. It was paper, actual paper, printed and hand-marked, and the marks were in 3 colors and had been made at different times by someone with poor handwriting and a great deal of patience. We do sky surveys, she said. Same patch. Over and over. Decades. We're not looking for you. We're looking for planets, mostly. Little dips in brightness. She put a finger on the sheet. About 60 years ago, a graduate student got annoyed because her plates kept losing stars. Not dimming. Losing. There 1 month. Gone. The next. Back. The month after. She thought it was a defect in the emulsion. It was. It wasn't. She turned the sheet around. Her name was Adezo Yellerin, and she spent 11 years cataloging defects nobody else thought were real. We named the catalog after her. You're in it. You have been in it since 41 days ago, which is the last time we imaged this patch before you arrived, and the entry is 6 weeks of a hole moving in a straight line at a constant rate. Duthrin told her to prove it. She asked him to pull his own log. He did it himself. That is the part I have never been able to soften in any account to anyone. He walked to the station and pulled the held breath's own station-keeping record, 43 days of position and drift, and he read it out into the compartment, expecting the numbers to diverge from her paper, and they did not diverge from her paper, and he kept reading anyway, further and further into the record, the way you keep pressing a limb after you already know it is broken, position for position. 6 weeks of us, drawn by hand by strangers from the absence we left behind. You didn't find us, I said. You found the hole. We find a lot of holes. She was refolding the paper. 2,411 of them in the current catalog. We assumed most were instrument error. Nobody in that compartment breathed. I have replayed it, and I am certain of that, 11 people and not one intake of air, because there was not a single one of us who did not know that number without being told. Doth Wren's neck went hot. I watched it happen. 200 years of discipline, and the tell came up on him like a bruise. He did not sit down. He put one hand on the edge of the station, that was all. And he said 2,411. And she said, give or take. The catalog's not clean. It is clean. Then it's clean. She picked up her case. I'd like to know why one of them stopped moving. He asked her, which one? You don't have names for them? We do? She was already turning toward the lock. We've been watching Mirage Shoal for 9 years. It hasn't drifted since the 3rd. The Concorde did not answer the question about Mirage Shoal. It convened instead. Thren Relay took 6 days to reach, and the drift clock lost 6 days while we traveled. Which is a sentence I have written in 4 separate accounts and have never once been able to make anyone feel. 9 became 3. The board met in a room called the Low Chamber, which is 6,000 years old, and which was built deliberately out of materials that eat sound. Speech dies at 2 meters there. You lean in to be heard. Volume is not forbidden in the Low Chamber. It is simply useless, and after a few thousand years of that, our people stopped distinguishing between the two. 9 seats. 41 prior votes to quarantine a leaking world. 41 of them carried. The motion on the slate was called Containment of the Soul Emission Cone, and the delegate who introduced it spoke for 19 minutes. I timed it. I was standing at the back with the rest of the witness rank, and I timed it because there was nothing else to do with my hands. His name was M. Tolan, speaker of record, and he had prepared. You could hear the preparation. Every clause arrived already balanced against the clause behind it, and he used 3 separate metaphors for the same idea, and then apologized for the second one. And he said the word regrettable 11 times. He never once said what containment meant. Coordinator Ilm Sarat did. She was in the 4th seat, and she had not spoken since we entered, and when Tolan finished, she asked him to state the operation. Removal of orbital and surface transmission capacity, all of it. The species retains ground-level function. They retain fire, Sarat said. Tolan explained why that was an unfair reduction of the proposal. It took him some time. Rhea Talbot had been brought as an exhibit rather than a witness, which is a distinction the board maintained carefully and which she did not appear to notice or resent. She stood where she was put. She had the case with her. When Tolan finally turned and asked whether she wished to make an appeal on behalf of her species, she said she did not, and the room went strange for a moment because nobody had prepared for that. You have nothing to say. I have something to play. She set the case on the floor. How long can this room hold audio? They told her the chamber suppressed all of it. She asked them to disable that. It took 40 minutes and 2 technicians. I have wondered since whether the board allowed it out of confidence or out of the particular courtesy we extend to the condemned. Probably the first. 41 votes will do that to a body. Then she played 127 years of us into a room designed to kill sound, and I watched 9 of the most disciplined people alive come apart one at a time. It was not a speech. That was the thing nobody was ready for. She had not curated it into an argument. She played it chronologically, and she played it raw. And it began with a weather report, some man reading barometric pressures in a language none of us had. And then a piece of music performed badly by children. And then 2 people arguing about the outcome of a game with such precise and unbearable seriousness that the 7th delegate leaned forward before he caught himself. He was first, Delegate Overon Hale, 7th seat, a man who had spent 40 years drafting emission penalties. He leaned in the way you lean toward a conversation that is not yours. Sarat did not move at all. The 3rd and 5th went together, at the recordings from their year 1969, which is a thing I still cannot describe properly because it was not the content that did it. It was the volume. Everything in the archive got louder as it went, not stronger transmitters. More people, more stations, more voices, more of them shouting over each other every single decade. A species that had been given 127 years to learn caution and had instead learned to be more numerous. The 2nd delegate covered the side of her head with one hand and left it there. Tolan waited until it stopped. Then he began the sentence about how a display of cultural artifacts did not bear on a question of collective survival, and Rhea let him get about 6 words in. 4 passes, she said. I beg your pardon. Your drift maps. 4 SIFT migrations crossed our cone 1978, 1994, 2011, 2049. She had not brought the maps. She did not need to. Every one of them had the dates. Pull our output for those 4 years. Tolan told her the board did not perform analysis at the request of an exhibit. Sarat performed it. She did it on her own slate, in front of everyone, and it took her under a minute because the archive was already indexed and the correlation was not subtle. Human transmission volume in each of those 4 years, compared against the baseline of the decade around it, up all 4 times, not slightly. In 2049 they had tripled it. Hale asked the question. He asked it out loud in a chamber where nobody asks anything out loud. And he asked it of Rhea directly, which was itself a violation of the exhibit rule. Did you know they were coming? No. Then what happened in 2049? An election, she said. 2 wars, and a lander touched down on Europa. Nobody said anything for a while. The archive was still running underneath, quietly now, some woman singing a child to sleep with a voice that had no training in it whatsoever, and the technicians had not thought to stop the playback because nobody had ordered them to. The vote was called, 4 for containment, 4 against, 41 prior votes, every one of them unanimous, and this one split down the middle of the board like something cracking along a fault that had always been there, which left the 4th seat. Ilm Sarat abstained. She gave no reason. The board is not required to give one, and in 6,000 years the low chamber had recorded 11 abstentions, and I had read all 11, and every single one of them came from a delegate who was ill. Sarat was not ill. She sat with her hands flat on the slate in front of her, and she looked at the human for a long moment, and she said nothing at all. And I could not think of a single thing that would make a woman who had already written those 4 words in Cheech, who had already written to leave a species undefended, refuse to finish the job. I did not understand it for another 11 days. The drift slowed on the 2nd day at Thren. 3 days became 11, then 11 became 26, and the projection kept sliding outward every time the passive net refreshed. Nobody could account for it. A sift migration is not a course, it is a browse. It moves at 40% of light between feeding intervals, and then it stops for reasons no one has ever recorded. And the entire discipline of drift prediction consists of watching where it stops and never being able to say why. The chore arrived on the 4th day into that reprieve with 3 ships and a ledger. You should know what the chore are because most accounts flatten them into obstruction, and they deserve better than that. They signed the doctrine 906 years ago, later than anyone, and they have kept it more completely than anyone since. Their emission penalty is death. It has been carried out 1,040 times against their own people, including 41 children over the age of 9, which is the age at which a chore is held to understand the rule. They are not fanatics. They are simply a species that decided a thing and then did not stop deciding it. Sevet Grail came into the concourse with the ledger carried ahead of her by 2 aides, which is a chore formality, and also a piece of stagecraft, and she stopped in the center of the floor where the delegations could see her from 3 sides. 906 years, she said, 71 settlements, 2,100,000 recovered. That is my column. May I hear yours? Rhea told her the human number. Say it fully. 0, 0. Grail let it sit. Then she began the piece she had prepared, and I want to be exact about it because everyone remembers that Grail was wrong, and almost nobody remembers that she was good. She did not deny the correlation. She granted it. She spent 4 minutes granting it in careful order, conceding the 4 passes and the archive and the volume, and then she turned all of it over in a single motion. A species that has not been eaten is not a species that cannot be eaten. It is a species that has not been eaten yet. My people were also unharmed once for 400 years, and we built cities on that arithmetic, and then we spent 9 centuries burying it. You're asking this body to adopt a survival method on the strength of 127 years of not having been noticed. Somebody in the Illith block struck the floor twice in support. It is the loudest thing that happens in our politics. Rhea asked her one question. Does the ledger have dates? It has everything. Then can I see the 900 years before it? Grail had that too. She was thorough. She put it up herself because she believed it helped her, and for about 90 seconds it did. The Corps had lost 12 settlements in the 9 centuries before the doctrine, and 71 in the 9 centuries after. She explained the discrepancy before anyone could raise it. Expansion. Better recovery counts. 12 was not 12. 12 was what they had been able to record with instruments that could barely see their own sky. The comparison was worthless, and she said so herself. And she was right. And I watched half the concourse decide the matter was closed. Then a chore scout stood up in the witness rank. Her name was Hesh Ver. She was not on any list. She had come in on one of Grail's own ships as loading crew, which is the only way a decertified scout travels, and she asked for the floor in the third-person form our procedure requires, and does not technically permit anyone to refuse. Grail refused it. The chair overruled her. It took 8 seconds, and it was the first time in 900 years. A Corps envoy had been overruled in a Concord chamber. Ver had a drift log, personal, not clan-held, which is itself an offense. She explained how a scout works, and she explained it plainly in the flat way of someone who has told a story so many times inside her own head that it has stopped having any shape. You do not track the sift. You cannot. You track the volume of space where nothing is reflecting, and you plot the leading edge of that volume across successive passes, and you get a vector, and the vector is a lie about 6% of the time. In the year she was decertified, her vector ran through 2 chore settlements, 40,000 kilometers apart, Kettle Bay and the 4th anchorage. Kettle Bay had a failed containment on a fusion plant, broadband. 6 days of it uncorrected because the repair crew could not reach the housing. The 4th anchorage was silent. It had passed inspection 11 days earlier. The drift arrived on the 9th of Hollow. It took the 4th anchorage, and Kettle Bay, the chair said. It veered. Nobody asked her to repeat it. She showed the log instead, the raw plot, 40,000 kilometers of separation and a leading edge that bent 19 degrees off a vector it had held for 200 days, and she had marked the bend herself in her own hand at the time, before she knew what it meant. She was ordered to strike it. She struck it. She kept a copy. Her clan sister was at the 4th anchorage. The concourse did not make a sound, because it cannot. What it did instead was hold still, and then stop holding still, delegation by delegation, in a spreading disorder of small movements that I have never seen before or since in that room. Grail did not look at the plot. She looked at Ver for a long moment, and then she left the floor, and she did it without hurry, and her aides had to gather the ledger behind her. Rhea said one thing on the way out. She said it to Ver and not to the room, and it was 4 words long, and I will not repeat it here because it was not mine. Duthren stayed. He went down to the floor when it was nearly empty, and he asked Heshver what her instrument's angular resolution had been at that range, which is a technical question, and a boring one, and the first question he had asked anybody in 6 weeks that did not have a conclusion already sitting inside it. They talked for an hour. I waited. That night, 400 light-years away, an administrator I had never heard of signed authorization for a controlled emission test at a derelict station called Senate Hollow, and named the human as its operator, and set the date 11 days out. Nobody in that concourse had asked for it. Administrator von Odeth had never met a human and had already written the finding. I read the authorization on the transit out. It ran to 9 pages, and the operative sentence was on the second. The test would establish whether human pattern emission constitutes a hazard to adjacent signatories. Establish, not assess, not measure. A man does not use that word by accident, and Odeth did not use words by accident. He had spent 41 years in the Illith Emission Service and had personally drafted the penalty schedule that killed no one and ended 900 careers, which is a different kind of thoroughness and in some ways a worse one. Senate Hollow had been dead for 800 years. Ore station, 4 docking spines, abandoned when the seam ran out and left standing because demolition makes light. The Concorde had run 340 controlled emission tests in its history. Every one of them was run from a place nobody would miss. 29 observers came, 9 delegations, 2 chore, and a Vothan trade attaché who had flown 11 days to be there and said nothing the entire time. The protocol was simple, and it was rigged. I did not see it. Rhea saw it in under a minute, standing at the emission console with the schedule in front of her, and the way she saw it was the part I have never stopped thinking about, because she did not object, and she did not accuse. She asked a question about the waveform. This is one source. It is a human pattern source, Odeth said. It's a beacon. It is calibrated to your species' spectral characteristics. Sure, she scrolled. Narrowband, directional, repeating on a 9-second cycle. Who transmits like that? He told her that the shape of the carrier was irrelevant to the question of whether the emission drew a response. She said it's the only relevant thing, and then she did not argue further, which surprised him and which I now understand was not restraint. She had already decided to run it correctly and let him watch. Here is what the Concorde did not know, and what I'm putting down carefully because it is the actual content of that day, and not the drama around it. Every emission test we had ever run used a beacon, 340 of them. It was the obvious instrument, 1 transmitter, 1 frequency, 1 repeating pulse, because that is what you build when your entire relationship with signal is the fear of leaking it. A beacon is a single thing, calling on purpose over and over in one direction. Human leakage is not that. She showed us on the console before she touched anything. 127 years of it, decomposed. Not one source. 40,000 simultaneous ones on the day the archive ended, uncoordinated, overlapping, none of them aimed at anything. Most of them talking across each other. and the whole mess redundant in a way no engineer would ever design, because it was not designed. 900 stations carrying the same weather report in 4 languages, 200 carrying a football match, the same voice arriving at a listener from 6 directions at once with a half-second of drift between them. A beacon says one thing, she said. Help. Odith asked what human transmission said. Nothing, that's the point. Nobody's talking to you. She ran it at the scheduled hour with 29 observers watching. And she ran it the way it actually comes off a planet, 400 emitters seated across the hollow's spines. Every one of them carrying different material, none of them synchronized, the whole thing swamping the local volume and noise that had no aim and no author. The Vothaean attaché left the compartment after 90 seconds. He came back. The drift was at 9 light hours and closing at 38%. It bent at 6. It took 4 minutes for the passives to confirm, and in those 4 minutes nobody in the compartment moved except Odith, who walked to the plot and stood in front of it with his hands behind his back and read the figures himself, twice the way Ren had read the station log on the held breath. Delegate Hale sat down where he was standing. The chore pair spoke to each other in a form of their language that has no written version. Someone in the Illith block asked out loud whether the emitters were still running, and was told that they were, and asked again 11 seconds later. 19 degrees, same as Heshver's log, same as a plot struck from a record 900 years ago by a scout who was decertified for keeping it. Odith did not concede. I want that in the account, because the version people tell now has him breaking, and he did not break. He asked for the run to be repeated. Rhea said she would repeat it as many times as he wanted. He asked whether the result would hold at closer range, and she said she did not know, and he asked whether she would stand on the station while they found out, and she said yes. And that was the end of the argument, though it took him another hour to stop having it. She did not say anything else about it. She went and sat on a crate by the spine lock with her boots off and her hands on her knees. And when Ren came past, she moved over so he could sit down. And neither of them spoke for a long time. I stayed at the plot. I stayed because the bend was wrong, not the size of it. The size was right. 19 degrees, exactly as recorded, exactly as promised. It was the center. A course change has a pivot, a point the arc turns around, and you can solve for it in under a minute with 3 position fixes, and every model we had ever built assumed that point would sit on the thing being avoided. It did not sit on Senate Hollow. I ran it 4 times. It sat 6 million kilometers off the Hollow's flank, in empty space on nothing, and I checked the volume against the observation register and found that it was not empty at all. Our own dark platform was there. 11 Samurai. Cold-shadowed, emitting nothing for 200 years. The drift had not turned away from the noise. It had turned toward them and stopped short. Ilm Sarat came for us 11 days after the vote, not a summons. She came herself on a courier with 2 crew, and she found me at the plot on Senate Hollow with 4 solutions for the same pivot point, stacked on the console and the 5th one running. She looked at them for a while. Then she asked how long I had been standing there. I told her. She said that was about right, and that it had taken her 9 years. And she asked me to bring the human. The founding annex of the Silence Doctrine is 140 pages. 2,006 people have read it in 7,040 years, and all of them were coordinators, and the reading is done in a room with a door that logs. Sarat unsealed it on a crate in a dead ore station in front of a human, a chore scout, a survey master, and a second listener with no clearance whatsoever. She said she would accept the penalty. Nobody argued with her because there was nothing to argue about. She was going to do it either way, and she had clearly been going to do it for some time. The doctrine was not written out of instinct. That is the first thing the annex tells you, and it tells you immediately. In the flat administrative voice of people who did not know they were founding anything, 906 worlds contributed loss records. 400 years of them. The founding survey was the largest piece of work our civilization has ever done, and it was by any standard I can apply, honest. They ran the correlation. They found it. Page 71. A table, 2 columns, worlds lost and emission status at time of loss, and the number at the bottom of it is 11%. 11% of worlds lost were emitting, 89% were dark. I read it 4 times. Ren read it over my shoulder and did not speak, and I could hear him not speaking, which is a thing I had learned to hear over 20 years. The founders saw the number, they did not hide it. Page 72 is 4,000 words of them looking straight at it, and I want to be fair to them because they were not fools, and they were not lying, and the thing they did next is the thing anyone would do. They concluded the dark worlds had not been dark enough. That is all. That is the entire hinge of 7,000 years. Emission discipline in that era was poor. Shielding was primitive. And a world that believed itself silent was very often leaking through a fusion housing or a poorly grounded relay. And so the 89% were reclassified as undetected failures rather than counted as what they were. The conclusion produced its own defense. Every silent world subsequently lost became further proof that silence must be practiced harder, and every improvement in shielding that failed to stop the losses became proof that the shielding was still insufficient, and there is no observation in this universe that could ever have contradicted it. We built 2,411 worlds on a claim that cannot fail. Ria asked whether she could see the 11%. Sarat gave it to her. 81 worlds with dates with emission profiles, and Ria went through them on the console for about 20 minutes while the rest of us sat in a cold compartment and waited for a stranger to finish reading our history. 74 of the 81 were beacons, distress transmissions, single source, narrowband, repeating, sent by populations that were already dying of something else and were calling for help. 6 were relay failures lasting under a day. 1 was Enet Reach, which ran an unshielded relay for 6 days to coordinate a harvest and was taken on the 6th, and which is the case every samurai child learns, and which turns out to be a single directional carrier saying the same thing over and over into empty space for 144 hours. Not one of the 81 looked anything like Earth. Here is what a hole is. The SIFT do not see the way we assumed. Nothing that hunts across 400 light-years is looking for a lit window. They rid volumes. A volume with a shape in it that is warm and quiet and coherent is a thing that has organized itself and then stopped announcing, and across whatever span of time built them, that has meant one thing reliably enough to become an instinct, something that has already been found. Something with reason to hide. Noise means the opposite. Noise means a volume they cannot resolve, 40,000 uncoordinated sources with no aim, generated by a population that has never in its history had cause to stop. And every predator that ever went into a volume like that and did not come out took its lesson with it. Ria had a version of this on a slate. She had written it before the board vote and not shown it to anyone, because it was a hypothesis, and she had exactly one data point. She had 400 now, with dates, in our own hand. Dothran asked the question. He asked it quietly, and he asked it of nobody. How many are in hard silence? Sarat had the figure. She had been carrying it for 9 years, which is why she abstained and which is why she was going to lose everything she had, and she gave it in the same voice she gives everything. 640 worlds under active emission blackout, 200 of them for over a century. Hard silence is not the normal condition of a Concord world. It is what a world does when it believes it has been marked, and the protocol requires total shutdown of all systems, including drive, including station keeping. Which is why the worlds under it stop moving. Ria put her hand flat on the console. She said, "Who told Mirage Shoal to stop moving?" Deep listener Asa Vey told Mirage Shoal to stop moving. She had done it 9 years earlier, on her own authority, and the authority was real. A deep listener holds a rank that exists in only 4 species, and it exists because someone has to be able to order 600,000 people to shut off their engines in the middle of the night without convening anything. Vey had used it 11 times in 40 years. 9 of those worlds were still there. That record is the whole of what she was, and she had not built it out of vanity. She had built it out of 9 years of listening to a volume of space and deciding, correctly, that something in it was wrong. Mirage Shoal was 3 habitats on a stripped moon, 490,000 people. Hard silence since the 3rd year, which meant no drive, no station keeping, no correction, which meant 9 years of drifting exactly where a hand-marked catalog on a human survey plate said a hole had stopped drifting. The drift reached the shoal's outer volume 11 days after Senate Hollow. We went with everything that would fly. 4 Concord ships and 1 human cutter, and the human cutter got there first because it did not have to spend 6 hours going quiet. They met us at the boundary with a standing order. The order was reasonable, that is the part people leave out. She had 490,000 people under blackout on a rock that could not maneuver, and a species with 127 years of history and a single verified test was proposing to floodlight them, and Vey's position was that she would permit it once the evacuation lift was clear of the surface, and not 1 minute before. Ria told her the lift would take 9 hours. Then you will transmit in 9 hours. They'll be inside 4. You have run 1 test. 2, Ria said, both bent, against a station with no population. Vey did not raise her voice. She had no need to. She was the only person in that volume everyone had already agreed to obey. You are asking me to make 490,000 people the 3rd. Ria said yes. Vey refused, and then she did something I did not expect and have never held against her. She granted it conditionally. She authorized a mission from the human cutter alone, at the outer marker, at the shoal's own risk, and none of ours, and she told Rhea that if the drift responded, she would open the whole volume. It was a compromise. It was also in the arithmetic that mattered. One source. Narrowband aimed. A beacon. Rhea took it anyway because it was that or nothing, and she took it with 411 minutes on the clock. I will not describe the next 6 hours as a battle. It was not one. It was a species doing logistics badly under time pressure, which is what almost all of dying is. The cutter ran everything it had. It was not enough, and Rhea knew it was not enough inside the first hour. And what she did then was take the cutter off the marker and put it against the shoal's second habitat and start seeding emitters by hand. One crew, 400 kilograms of transmitter at a time, because 40,000 uncoordinated sources is a thing you cannot fake with one ship, and she was going to get as close to it as 4 people could carry. Coyote Oilaren was on the second run. He was 29. His grandmother's name was on the catalog that found us. He had been aboard for 6 weeks and had asked me, twice, whether Samurai had a written music, and I had told him no, and he had said that was a shame in a tone that suggested he intended to do something about it later. The breach came through the third habitat at 4 hours and 9 minutes. The second habitat was still hard. They got 211,000 off. It is a real number, and I put it down because the people who did it deserve to have it counted, and because the other number is not something I can make readable. Coyote was not one of the 211,000, and neither were the people he was carrying transmitters toward. The drift bent at 4 hours and 51 minutes. 51 minutes late, it bent 19 degrees, the same 19. And it bent the moment the second habitat's emitters came up on the last run he made, and nobody on either side of that volume felt anything about it except sick. The recovery took 9 days. Vey was there for all of it. She did not leave, and she did not speak to the human delegation, and she went out with the survey teams personally, which no deep listener has ever done. And on the 6th day, they cut a plate out of the third habitat's dorsal shell and brought it back to the boundary, 2 meters across. The entry scar begins at the top corner. Here's what the plate says, and it says it without anybody's help, which is why it ended up in front of a conclave 4 weeks later. The third habitat was under total blackout. The first habitat had a thermal housing that had been failing for 9 years and leaking broadband the entire time. And it was 40 kilometers away, and it was untouched. The breach did not begin at the nearest surface or the warmest or the weakest. It began at the coldest point on the moon, and it worked outward from there toward the noise, and it stopped. Duthran held the plate up to the light for a long time and then put it down and said nothing at all. Asa Vey asked one question. She asked it of the survey lead, in the procedural form, and it was whether the plate's orientation had been recorded before extraction. It had. She said thank you, and she went back out with the next team, and she was still going out with them on the 9th day when the rest of us left. There were 400 survivors held at the boundary station who had nowhere to be sent yet. They had been under blackout for 9 years, most of the children their entire lives, and someone had put them in a lit compartment with heat and noise and no instruction about any of it. One of them found me by the lock. She was perhaps 6. She stood there for a while working out whether I was a person, and then she asked me the only thing anyone in that compartment wanted to know. She asked whether they were allowed to talk now. I did not answer her, neither did anyone else. Marshal Turam Hald opened the conclave by declining to look at her. The exhibit will be seated at the rear. Rhea sat at the rear. Thren had never held a conclave. It had held 400 sessions and 11 tribunals and nothing that required the physical presence of every signatory. And there is no procedure for that because the doctrine was written by people who assumed we would never all be in one place at one time. 940 delegations reached it. The rest sent proxies or nothing. The concourse floor is rated for 600, and they took the doors off 2 adjacent halls and ran the audio through, which is the first time in 7,000 years that anything in a Concord building was made louder on purpose. 41 visiting attachés from non-signatory space were seated in the upper gallery. Hald had invited them. That is a thing you do when you intend the outcome to be witnessed. He was 90 years in the fleet, and he was not a stupid man, and I want to be careful with him, because the account that survives makes him a villain, and he was something more ordinary and more dangerous than that. He had spent his career being responsible for outcomes. 940 delegations were now looking at him for a decision, and the decision on offer was to unwind the only survival practice his species had ever had on the strength of 2 field tests, one of which had been 51 minutes late, and 490,000 people had been on that rock, and 211,000 of them had come off it. He read the terms in under a minute's surrender of orbital transmission capacity, surface systems capped at 19 kilometers of range. Assigned instrument of silence, binding on Earth and every human vessel in Concord space, effective in 9 days. Refusal to be treated as a standing hazard. With the fleet response that phrase implies. Then he produced the 4 words. He had found Sarat's reply to the original drift warning, and he read it out to 940 delegations without preamble, and the effect was exactly what he intended. Understood. Do not warn them. A coordinator of the Concorde had known a migration was crossing an inhabited cone and had ordered silence, and every delegate in that concourse understood, correctly, that this was not a scandal about one woman. It was what the doctrine had required of all of them for 7,000 years, and Hald had just made them look at it. He said the human position was being advanced by a coordinator who had abandoned a species to be eaten, and now wished to be forgiven for it by that same species. It was cruel and it was accurate. Sarat did not stand up. Delegate Hale turned in his seat toward the 4th chair and then turned back. Hald asked whether the exhibit wished to respond. Rhea stood. She had lost 9 kilograms since Senate Hollow, and she did not look at Sarat, and she did not look at the gallery, and when she spoke it was flat in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. Who do you trust least? Hald asked her to clarify. In this room, the analysts. Whoever hates this the most and is good at math. She put a case on the floor. Give me 9 of them. He chose them himself. That was his error, and it was also the only honest thing available to him, and I have never been able to decide which it was more of. 4 Chor, 2 Illith from the emission service, a Vothan statistician, and 2 of his own fleet analysts. Not one of them had spoken in favor of anything the humans had said. They were sequestered for 11 days with no human contact. What Rhea gave them was not a conclusion. This is the part worth understanding, because it is the only reason the thing held. She gave them 4,206 loss events, every one from Concord archives, none from human sources, and she gave them the one methodological instruction that the founders had never applied to themselves. Do not use the world's own emission status. Reconstruct it from somewhere else, that is, the whole of it. Every founding era classification of a lost world as silent came from that world's self-report, filed before it died, and a world that is leaking through a failed housing does not know it is leaking. That is what failure means. So you throw the self-reports away, you take the third-party record instead, the passive logs of neighbors, the navigational archives of ships that passed through the volume in the preceding decade, the maintenance filings that describe unrepaired systems, and you rebuild what the world was actually emitting on the day it was taken, from people who had no reason to lie about it and mostly did not know they were recording it. The 9 came back on the 12th day and asked for the floor. The Vothan statistician read it, because the chore would not. Of the 411 worlds the founders had classified as silent at time of loss, 290 were reclassified as leaking, not by human analysis. By the Concorde's own passive records, cross-checked 9 ways, by 9 people who had entered that room intending to break the dataset and had spent 11 days failing to. The remaining 121 were dark and were taken, and there is no account of them, and the report said so plainly, which is the sentence that convinced the room more than any of the rest of it. And of every loss event, with a reconstructed emission profile, the ones that were narrow, aimed, and repeating ran 9-1 against the ones that were broad and unaimed and numerous. Hale stood, then the Illith block in no order at all without the floor. A chore analyst put the report down and turned it over and did not touch it again. In the upper gallery, a Vothan attaché who had flown 11 days to say nothing leaned forward against the rail, and the sound in that concourse was not applause, because we do not have that, but it was not silence either, and it went on for some time. Hald read the report himself twice. Then he set it down and said the tests were insufficient, and the sample was contaminated, and the Concorde would not be reorganized around 127 years of one species' luck. The term stood 9 days. Rhea picked up her case. She said one thing on the way past the fleet bench, and it was not an argument. You picked them. That night, Hald sent 3 words to a fleet element holding 400 light-years off, on a channel that does not log, and the element began to move, and not one person in that concourse knew what he had ordered or why. The sift arrived at Thren on the 9th day, not the Soul Drift, a second migration, 411 light-years off the first, moving into a volume that contained 940 delegations, 206 ships, and every functioning organ of Concorde government in one place for the first time in 7,000 years. Hald had known for 11 days. That is what the 3 words were. A fleet element had been holding on the far edge of the volume, watching a leading edge that did not resolve into anything until it was inside 4 light days, and he had ordered it to hold position and report to him alone, because a conclave that learned there was a migration inbound would have gone hard silent inside the hour, and his terms would have carried by acclamation before the 9th day ever came. He did not do it to kill anyone. I have read his statement. He did it because he believed the outcome was already correct, and he wanted the room to reach it without panic. The element broke his order at 4 light days and reported to the floor. What happened next took 9 hours, and I'm going to put it down in order. Because every account I have read compresses it into a decision, and it was not a decision. It was 940 separate ones. Hald ordered hard silence. He had the authority, and nobody has ever disputed that he had it. 206 ships and the relay itself, total shutdown. Drives cold, and the concourse began to darken bench by bench in the practiced way we have all been drilled in since we were 9 years old. Rhea did not argue with him. She had stopped arguing 4 weeks earlier on a rock full of dead people. She asked the chair for the emergency instrument that lets any delegation address all signatories simultaneously. It exists for exactly one purpose, which is to warn everyone at once, and it has been used 4 times in 7,000 years, and every time it has been used to tell worlds to go dark. The chair granted it. Hale seconded, it carried by 1, and then she did not use it. She handed it to Sarat and sat down at the back where she had been told to sit. Sarat had 9 minutes. What she said in them was not persuasion, and it was not defense. She read the reconstruction figures, the 290, the 121, the 9-to-1 in the flat administrative voice of a woman reading a table, and then she said that she had ordered a species left unwarned 9 years ago and that she had been correct under the doctrine, and that this was the entire problem, and she gave the instrument to the floor. The vote was not called. There was no procedure for what happened. Delegations simply began to signal, one at a time, into an open channel, and the relay logged them in order of arrival, and that log is the reason I can tell you this properly. Hale first, the 7th seat, who had leaned forward at an argument about a game. Then the Illith block, 11 of them together, which nobody expected. Then 240 in under a minute, and then it slowed badly, because the ones left were the ones for whom it cost the most. 640 worlds were under hard silence, and hard silence cannot be broken from outside. Every one of them had to be reached by courier or by a neighbor's relay and told by someone they trusted, and 200 of them had been dark for over a century and had procedures in place for ignoring exactly this kind of instruction. Osave broke Mirage Shoal. She did it from the boundary station with 400 survivors aboard, on her own authority, the same authority she had used to silence it 9 years earlier, and she did not make a statement and has never made one since. The log records her order, and then it records her signature, and then it records 411 other worlds inside the next hour. Because a deep listener with 9 correct calls out of 11 had just spent that entire record on one instruction, and everyone in the Concorde knew what it had cost her to do it. The chore went last. 906 years, 1,040 executions, and Sevet Grail stood on the floor at hour 7 and said that her people would not be first and would not be absent, and gave the order, and Heshver's name was entered into the clan record beside it in the position reserved for the person whose testimony compelled a reversal. That is a core formality. It restores everything. Turam Hald never signaled. He also never enforced his own order, and at hour 4 he released the fleet element to carry the instruction outward, which is not nothing, and is the only thing his statement asks anyone to remember. 2,209 worlds came up, 202 did not, and 11 of those refused, and the rest could not be reached in time. It was not coordinated. That was the point, and I do not think more than 9 people in that concourse understood it at the time. Nobody sent a message. There was nothing to say and nobody to say it to. 2,200 worlds simply stopped suppressing what they had always been producing. Traffic control, or telemetry. 4,000 years of archives, nobody had ever transmitted arguments, weather, a Vathan agricultural service, reading soil figures into an empty channel because it was the only thing it had. All of it at once, from every direction, unaimed, redundant, colliding. 40,000 sources became 11 million in under an hour. The leading edge was at 9 light hours. It closed to 6. The concourse watched it on a plot the size of a wall with the sound of the entire Concorde coming through the hall doors behind them, and it closed to 4. And Hale asked once whether anything had changed and was told no, and it closed to 2. At 1 light hour and 40 minutes it stopped. It held there for 9 minutes. Nothing about it resolved. It never has. It was a volume of space that gave nothing back, sitting at the edge of ours, and the only thing anyone could measure about it was where it was not. Then it bent, 19 degrees, the same 19 off a vector it had held for 240 days, and it went out through the empty quarter and kept going, and the pivot point solved 6 million kilometers off our flank, On nothing, on the one volume in the region that was still dark. Dothran was standing beside me. He put one hand on the rail. He said, "That's the third," and I said, "Fourth," and he said, "I don't count the hollow," and that was all either of us managed for some time. Rhea Talbot was at the back of the room where she had been seated, watching a plot she had described accurately 11 weeks earlier to 9 people who did not believe her, and she did not stand up, and she did not say anything. And when Hale finally turned around to look for her, she had already gone out through the side hall to find out whether the couriers had reached the 202 Thren. Stayed loud for a long time. Nobody planned that either. The instrument had been used to break silence, and there was no instrument for putting it back. So for 9 days, the relay carried whatever the 2,209 worlds were producing, and the concourse simply left the hall doors off, and delegations that had spent their entire adult lives inside emission discipline sat in the upper gallery at odd hours, listening to ore telemetry from a moon they had never heard of. There was no celebration. I want that in the account, because the version people tell now has one. What there was instead was 9 days of clerical work carried out by exhausted people who had discovered that the end of a 7,000-year practice generates an enormous amount of paperwork. The 202 took 4 months. 11 refused outright and are still dark. 9 could not be reached before the drift cleared the region and were reached afterward, which is a different sentence than it sounds like, because 2 of them had gone dark for a reason, and one of those 2 was not there anymore. The remaining 182 came up over the following season in no order at all, 1 and 2 at a time, as couriers arrived at rocks that had been under blackout since before anyone aboard them was born. The couriers reported that the hardest part was never the argument. It was the 4 or 5 hours afterward, standing in a compartment with people who had been told the rule was the rule since they were children, while those people worked out what to do with their hands. Sarat accepted the penalty for unsealing the annex. She did not contest it, and she did not permit anyone to contest it for her. And the Concorde removed her from the 4th seat and struck her record, and then, 11 weeks later, seated her on the drafting committee for the amendment, because there was nobody else alive who had read the founding annex and understood what was wrong with it. She served on it for 9 years. She never took another coordinator's post and never explained why. And when the histories began to be written, she declined all of them. Turam Hald filed his statement and retired at the end of the season. He wrote 4 pages. 3 of them are an account of the 11 days he held the report given plainly, with no defense in them at all. And the 4th is the release order he gave the fleet element at hour 4, reproduced in full. He asks that it be read alongside the rest. It usually is not. Asave stayed at Mirage Shoal. She turned down the review board, the inquiry, and the seat they offered her afterward, and she is still out there with the recovery survey, which has now been running for 6 years and has recovered rather more than anyone expected it to. She has never spoken publicly about the order she gave 9 years ago, or the one she gave to reverse it. Sevet Grail went home. What the chore did with the 7040 is a matter for the chore, and it took them 2 years, and I am not qualified to describe it. I saw her once more, in a transit hall at Thren, standing at a rail watching a Concorde traffic feed run open in a public concourse, which is a thing that had not existed 9 months earlier. She stood there for some time, then she went to her ship. Heshver flew it. Dothran took a teaching post. That surprised everyone except me. He had 211 years of survey behind him, and he spent the rest of it in a compartment with 9 cadets at a time. And what he taught was not emission discipline. He taught them how the founding survey was conducted, honestly, in full, the 400 years of it, and the 906 worlds, and the enormous care of it. And then he taught them page 71, and then he asked them what they would have concluded. He said, most of them concluded what the founders concluded. He said that was the lesson. Rhea Talbot went back to work. She declined the delegation seat. She declined the honors, which were considerable and which she never gave a reason for refusing, and she took a posting on the deep survey that Adea Zoe Lauren's catalog had grown into, and she spent the following years doing what she had been doing before any of us existed to her, which is imaging the same patch of sky over and over and marking the places where stars go missing. She wrote to me twice a year. Neither letter mentioned any of this. The Terran Long Listen program renamed its outbound array after a 29-year-old cargo handler who asked me twice whether my people had a written music. I have been working on that. It is slow. We have 11 notations now, and none of them are any good, and I am told that the correct response to this is to keep going. The 400 survivors from the shoal were resettled across 9 worlds in the 2nd season. I went to one of the receiving stations because I had a question I had been carrying since the boundary and no particular right to an answer. She was 7 by then. She did not remember me, and I did not tell her. The compartment was lit and warm and appallingly loud, several hundred people talking over each other in 4 languages with a feed running underneath that nobody was listening to, and she was in the middle of it arguing with another child about something I could not follow, and she did not look up. Concord Instrument 4211 is 9 pages long. It repeals the silence doctrine, dissolves the emission service, and vacates 1,040 core sentences. It carries no preamble because the drafting committee could not agree on one and Surratt ruled that none was needed. The first page carries a single line instead received on open channel, unanswered for 11 years, and recorded there without comment or attribution. Hello, is anyone out there? We've been trying to reach you for years.